Hello, ninth graders. We're continuing our read of Into the Clouds, and we are now at a place where they're going back to the mountain. And a couple of people have been on this trek before, hoping to climb K2. Chapter 12, page 137, Back to the Mountain. Bob Bates thought they were going to die before they made it to K2. He was 15,000 feet in the air, staring out the window of a cargo plane. At that altitude, you might expect to fly clear of any obstacles on Earth. Not in the Himalayas. In 1938, Bates and Houston had covered this part of the expedition on foot. Now they were flying the 180 miles from Rawalpindi to Skardu, and the last half of the ride took them through a landscape unlike any other. The plane wove through a towering skyline of mountain spires. It skimmed 15,000-foot ridges. It dove through gorges that narrowed enough to shear the wings off if a gust of wind came up unannounced. Bates and Houston remembered this mystical wonderland from 1938, and they were ecstatic to be back. But even from a plane, you could feel the danger in the landscape below. 50 miles outside of Skardu, they veered around the snow-covered bulk of Nanga Parbat. Journalists now called it the Killer Mountain because of its tragic history. The climbers pressed their noses against the windows and tried to pick out landmarks. There was the Rakat Ridge, where Mummery became the first mountaineer to vanish in the Himalaya, and 9 more climbers were lost in 1934. And there maybe was the site of Camp 4, where a midnight avalanche smothered 16 climbers in their tents in 1937. More than 30 lives had been lost in Nanga Parbat, and no one had reached its 26,660-foot summit. K2 stood another 1,600 feet higher. With Nanga Parbat behind them, the plane cleared a final ridge and plummeted like a stone. Just when it seemed they were going to nosedive into the earth, they leveled off. The plane skimmed a pasture so close it nearly took out a few cows. Then it rumbled to a stop on a strip of dirt known as the Skardu Airport. So here's a picture of what was called the Killer Mountain from a window of the plane. Nanga Parbat. On the way to Skardu, the climbers felt like returning heroes, even though they hadn't set foot on K2 yet. The entire village of 7,000 turned out to welcome them. School children lined the road into town. They cheered and draped necklaces of flowers around the Americans. Pakistan was one of the world's newest nations. India had won its independence from Britain in 1947, and 2 years later, Pakistan had been carved out of its borders to give India's Muslim population a homeland. The people of Skardu wanted the Americans to support their young nation when they returned home. A loud chant went up from the crowd. Pakistan Zindabad, America Zindabad. Long live Pakistan, long live America. Houston and the others enjoyed the welcome, but as they got ready to leave for the mountain, they had a sinking feeling that beyond the borders of this tiny town, no one cared about their expedition anymore. The rest of the world was too busy celebrating the conquest of a different mountain. Everest had been summited. The news had made it to Rawalpindi before they boarded their plane. On May 29th, the Sherpa climber Tenzing Norgay and a beekeeper from New Zealand named Edmund Hillary fought their way to the highest point on Earth. 10 expeditions had failed on Everest. 15 climbers had died trying. Now, 2 men had spent 15 minutes at 29,028 feet looking down on the world. Houston and the others knew the rest of the world was riveted. The London Times devoted a special 32-page section to the climb. The Queen of England received the news through diplomatic channels. Hillary was knighted before he even got off the mountain. What was left to do? True climbers knew that K2 was a more difficult mountain than Everest, but most of the world didn't care. What mattered were the superlatives, and in mountain climbing, tallest was the one that counted. Even if Houston and the others managed to survive the cold and the wind, even if they conquered the rock, ice, and snow, even if they fought their way to the top, they would still be standing 780 feet below the throne carved out by Hillary and Norgay. As the Boston Globe put it 5 months earlier, a conquest of K2 by Americans is not going to bring any avalanche of fame if the British make the grade with Everest, the monarch of them all. But fame wasn't what had brought Charlie Houston back to K2. He was there to test himself against one of the most demanding challenges nature had to offer. He allowed himself a moment of regret. Then he sent his congratulations to the British team by telegram. D. Molinar found a reason to be happy about the news. Now K2 is the highest unclimbed mountain on Earth, he wrote in his diary. We're determined to carry on our plans as before. On June 5th, the third American Karakoram expedition dropped all news of the outside world and began the march to K2. The world they were leaving behind had completely transformed since 1938. But as they made their way out of the village, it seemed as though nothing had changed in centuries. There were no roads, only narrow mountain trails and dusty plains. They crossed one river on a raft made from inflated goat skins. At 3 more, they held their breath and wobbled across on the infamous 300-foot rope bridges. With every step, it seemed they traveled back in time. The porters who followed them into the mountains only added to the feeling. There were 90 of them, bent under the weight of 60-pound loads. They carried an odd assortment of crates and bundles, all of it bound together and strapped to their backs with goat hair rope. They seemed to come from a different century than the Western Sahibs. Houston and his team marched ahead wearing waterproof boots, windproof parkas, and Eddie Bauer jackets filled with soft, warm goose down. The porters had leather mucklucks between their feet and the harsh landscape of rocks and river crossings. Many of them simply went barefoot. They carried thin shawls to huddle under when the mountain air got cold. This time, at least, Houston had a supply of snow goggles to hand out when they reached the blinding glare of the glacier ice. It was an odd, unbalanced relationship between the porters and these men of privilege who came to their homeland with money to spend and back-breaking work to hire out. The two groups waged a tense battle for power on the trail. Every couple of days, the porters refused to move an inch until they were promised more money. A few days into the trek, gear started to disappear. A pair of boots here, an ice axe there. The Americans kept 1-hour watches through the night. By the end of the trek, the porters were begging for clothes, food, and shoes. It didn't help that the two groups spoke different languages. Negotiations took place with a lot of arm waving and one-word sentences. A British transport officer named Tony Strether had joined the team, and it was his job to organize the porters. But everyone had to communicate daily with the men who carried their gear. Molinar came with a list of Hindustani phrases in his diary. Saf pani leo for bring clean water. Jaldi karo for do it quickly. Also included was an essential term for campfire conversation, pad, the word for fart. In the late afternoon of June 19th, after a final 12-mile slog up the Godwin-Austen Glacier, the porters set down their loads for good. Underfoot was a jumble of jagged black rock. Overhead rose the snow-dusted ridges of K2. The expedition had arrived at base camp. And we're going to stop there in the middle of page 144 and pick up there tomorrow. Thanks so much, ninth graders. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. Bye. See you later.